The courtroom buzzed with tension as people packed the benches, smartphones ready to capture what promised to be the legal showdown of the year. Attorney Richard Hayes adjusted his expensive tie and shot a cold smile toward the witness stand. His reputation as a shark in the courtroom hadn't come from being nice. Clint Eastwood sat with perfect posture, his weathered face unreadable as he waited to testify in the property dispute case that had drawn national attention. At 94, he still commanded respect with just his presence, though Hayes seemed determined to change that. "Mr. Eastwood," Hayes began, his voice carrying a hint of mockery. "I'm sure everyone here is very impressed to have a celebrity in our humble courtroom today." Judge Eleanor Harmon frowned from behind her bench. "Counsel, please keep to relevant questioning." "Of course, Your Honor." Hayes nodded with fake politeness. "Mr. Eastwood, you claim to have knowledge about the property boundaries in question. Is that correct?" "Yes, that's correct," Eastwood replied, his voice still carrying that familiar gravelly quality that had become his trademark. Hayes paced in front of the witness stand. "And we should trust your memory on this because, I mean at your age, remembering what you had for breakfast must be challenging enough." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. The judge's gavel came down hard. "Mr. Hayes, that is completely inappropriate. One more comment like that and you'll be in contempt." Hayes raised his hands in apology, but the smirk never left his face. "I'm simply establishing the reliability of the witness, Your Honor." For the next 20 minutes, Hayes continued his questioning, each one designed to undermine Eastwood's credibility while staying just within the boundaries of what the judge would allow. He questioned whether Eastwood was confusing the actual property with movie sets he'd worked on. He suggested that perhaps Eastwood's fame had given him a sense of entitlement about land he had no real claim to. "Tell me, Mr. Eastwood," Hayes said, leaning against the witness stand with casual disrespect, "do you expect special treatment because of who you are? Because in this courtroom, your Hollywood credentials mean nothing." Through it all, Eastwood maintained his composure. His answers remained clear and direct, though the tightness around his eyes revealed his growing frustration. "I'm here as a citizen," Eastwood replied. "Nothing more." The spectators whispered among themselves. Many had come expecting to see the tough guy persona Eastwood was famous for, perhaps hoping he'd respond with one of his iconic movie lines. Instead, they watched as he endured the lawyer's taunts with quiet dignity. Hayes wasn't finished. He walked over to his table and picked up a DVD case. "You played a lot of tough guys, didn't you, Mr. Eastwood?" He held up the case showing Eastwood in his prime as Dirty Harry. Men who took matters into their own hands when the law wasn't moving fast enough for them. "Objection." The opposing counsel jumped to his feet. "This has no relevance to the property dispute. I'm establishing the witness's attitude toward legal proceedings, Your Honor," Hayes argued smoothly. Judge Harmon narrowed her eyes. "I'll allow it, but you're on very thin ice, counselor." Hayes turned back to Eastwood with a predatory smile. "Is that why we're here today? You think you can just claim whatever property you want because you're Clint Eastwood?" "That's not why. I'm here," Eastwood replied, his patience visibly wearing thin. "Then enlighten us," Hayes said, spreading his arms wide for the benefit of the jury and onlookers. He even mimicked Eastwood's famous squint, causing several people to laugh nervously. "Why does this particular piece of land matter so much to someone who could buy half the county if he wanted to?" The courtroom fell silent, waiting for Eastwood's response. The actor's eyes, still sharp despite his age, fixed on Hayes with an intensity that had made him a screen legend. "Because," Eastwood began, "some things matter more than money." Hayes let out a theatrical laugh. "How profound. I'm sure that sounds great in a movie script, but we're dealing with real property law here." Judge Harmon's patience had clearly reached its limit. She leaned forward, her voice stern. "Mr. Hayes, I've warned you repeatedly. One more disrespectful comment and—" "It's all right, Your Honor," Eastwood interrupted, surprising everyone. "I'd like to answer his question properly." The judge hesitated, then nodded. "Go ahead, Mr. Eastwood." All eyes turned to Eastwood as he straightened in his chair, his gaze never leaving Hayes. The ruthless lawyer's smirk began to fade as something in Eastwood's expression changed. You asked why this land matters to me, Eastwood said, his voice quiet but clear enough that everyone strained to catch every word. Maybe it's time you learned the real reason. Hayes suddenly looked uncertain, as though the script he'd been following had taken an unexpected turn. What if I told you, Eastwood continued, that I have a connection to this land that goes back much further than any deed or property record shows? The courtroom held its collective breath. Even Hayes seemed caught off guard by the shift in Eastwood's demeanor. What if I told you, Eastwood said, leaning forward slightly, that I know things about you, counselor, about your family? Hayes froze mid-step. For the first time, his confident facade cracked. What are you talking about? Judge Harmon looked confused but didn't interrupt as Eastwood reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, worn photograph. He held it up, though only Hayes could see what it showed. Do you recognize this? Eastwood asked. The color drained from Hayes's face. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Your Honor, Eastwood said, turning to the judge, I'd like to submit this photograph as evidence. The bailiff took the photo and handed it to Judge Harmon. She studied it with a puzzled expression, then looked up at Hayes, who stood motionless. All his previous arrogance vanished. Mr. Hayes, she said, do you know what this is? Hayes swallowed hard. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost all its mockery. That's my father, he said quietly. But I don't understand how. 40 years ago, Eastwood said, his voice taking on a gentleness no one in the courtroom had expected. I was filming on location not far from here. There was an accident, a fire that broke out in one of the trailers. Your father was working as part of the crew. The spectators leaned forward, captivated by the unexpected turn of events. This wasn't the courtroom drama they had come to see. It was something much more human, much more real. He saved 3 people that day. Eastwood continued. Went back, into the burning trailer when everyone else was running the other way. I was the last one he pulled out. A murmur swept through the courtroom. Judge Harmon made no attempt to quiet it, her own expression showing her absorption in Eastwood's story. Hayes stood perfectly still, looking like a man who had just had the ground shift beneath his feet. The land we're discussing today, Eastwood said, belonged to your family then. Your father told me about it while we were waiting for the medics, how it had been in your family for generations, how much he loved it. Hayes's voice was barely audible. We had to sell it. After he died, my mother couldn't keep up with the taxes. Eastwood nodded, a sadness in his eyes that seemed to reach beyond the present moment, back into memories long held private. I know, and I've been waiting a long time for the right moment to set things right. The courtroom remained utterly silent, hanging on every word of the unfolding story that no one, least of all Richard Hayes, had seen coming. The silence in the courtroom felt heavy as everyone processed what Eastwood had just revealed. Richard Hayes stood frozen, his legal pad hanging limply at his side, all traces of his earlier smugness gone. Judge Harmon leaned back in her chair, her stern expression softening slightly as she looked between the Hollywood legend and the now humbled attorney. Mr. Hayes, she said gently, do you need a moment? Hayes shook his head, though he clearly did. No, Your Honor. I'd like to continue. His voice had lost its sharp edge. Eastwood watched him with those penetrating blue eyes that had captivated movie audiences for decades. There was no triumph in his expression, only a patient waiting. Hayes cleared his throat and tried to regain his composure. Mr. Eastwood, you're claiming to have known my father. That doesn't change the facts of this case. No, it doesn't, Eastwood agreed, his gravelly voice somehow softer now. But it might help explain them. The spectators who had come expecting entertainment found themselves witnessing something far more compelling than they'd anticipated. Phones remained up, recording every word, but there was a different energy in the room now, a hushed respect for something authentic unfolding before them. Your father told me he wanted that land to stay in your family, Eastwood continued. He had plans for it, dreams. Hayes's professional mask slipped further. We couldn't afford to keep it. After the accident, after he was gone, everything fell apart. I know. Eastwood nodded. I tried to find your family afterward, but you'd moved away. By the time I tracked you down, the land had been sold to developers. Hayes looked confused. You tried to find us? Why? To thank him. To help if I could. Eastwood shifted slightly in his seat, his eyes briefly showing his age. Your father never got the recognition he deserved for what he did that day. Judge Harmon cleared her throat. Mr. Eastwood, while this is certainly moving, I'm still not clear on how it relates to the current property dispute. Eastwood nodded respectfully toward her. I'm getting there, Your Honor. Hayes had moved back to his table, shuffling papers without really seeing them, clearly trying to gather his thoughts. When he turned back to Eastwood, his approach had completely changed. So you're saying my father saved your life, he said, his voice unsteady. And now what? You feel you owe him something? I've always felt that, Eastwood replied simply. A woman in the gallery began crying softly. Someone else whispered, I knew he was a good guy in real life too. The judge didn't bother silencing them. Hayes's face showed a mixture of emotions, confusion, disbelief, and something else, something more vulnerable. So when I've been standing here mocking you, questioning your motives, you've been waiting for you to find your way to the truth. Eastwood finished for him. Hayes ran a hand over his face. I don't understand. If this is about some debt you feel you owe my father, why not just tell me? Why let me make a fool of myself in open court? Because this isn't just about you and me, Eastwood said, gesturing to the packed courtroom. It's about everyone who's being pushed out by those developers. Everyone who's had their history erased for a quick profit. The opposing counsel, representing the development company, stood up. Your Honor, this is all very theatrical, but it has nothing to do with the legal ownership of the property in question. Judge Harmon held up her hand. I'll be the judge of what's relevant in my courtroom, counselor. She turned back to Eastwood. Please continue, Mr. Eastwood. Eastwood shifted forward, addressing not just Hayes now, but everyone present. When I found out those developers were using legal loopholes to take over properties all throughout this area, including the land that once belonged to the Hayes family, I decided to get involved. Hayes looked down at the photograph that had been returned to the evidence table. It showed a younger man, his father, standing next to a much younger Clint Eastwood, both of them smiling despite being covered in soot and ash. The mockery, Hayes said slowly as understanding dawned on him. You knew I would do that, you wanted me to. A hint of Eastwood's famous half-smile appeared. I've been in this business a long time. I know how to set up a scene. Murmurs rippled through the courtroom as people began to realize they were witnessing something that had been carefully orchestrated. Your Honor, the opposing counsel interrupted again, his voice rising with indignation. This is clearly some kind of publicity stunt. Mr. Eastwood is a professional actor after all, and your clients are professional con artists, Eastwood replied calmly, turning to face him. They've been using shell companies and fake historical surveys to undermine property rights all across this county. The lawyer's face flushed. That's slander. It's the truth, Eastwood said, his voice taking on the steely quality that had made him famous. And we can prove it. Hayes looked up sharply. We? Eastwood nodded toward the back of the courtroom where an older woman had quietly entered during the proceedings. She carried a large accordion file folder and wore a determined expression that somehow mirrored Eastwood's own. That's, Hayes whispered, recognition flooding his face. Your Aunt Linda, Eastwood confirmed. Your father's sister. She never stopped fighting for this land. The woman made her way down the aisle, her head held high as whispers followed. Her progress. Hayes stared at her as though seeing a ghost. I haven't seen her since your father's funeral, Eastwood finished. She's been gathering evidence against these developers for years. Evidence that proves they falsified documents to invalidate your family's original claim to the land. The opposing counsel was on his feet again, his face now pale. Your Honor, this is completely irregular. We weren't notified about any new witnesses or evidence. Judge Harmon studied him with a level gaze. Considering the nature of the accusations being made, counselor, perhaps we should take a short recess so you can confer with your clients. As the judge announced a 30-minute recess, the courtroom erupted into excited conversation. Hayes remained at his table, staring at the photograph of his father and Eastwood, as though trying to reconcile it with everything he thought he knew. The woman, his Aunt Linda, approached him slowly, the years of separation evident in her hesitant steps. Eastwood watched from the witness stand, making no move to interrupt their reunion. "Richard," she said, her voice carrying the same accent that Hayes had worked so hard to eliminate from his own speech. "You look just like him." Hayes stood up awkwardly, unsure whether to shake her hand or hug her. "Aunt Linda, I don't understand any of this." She placed the accordion file on the table. "Then let me explain." She glanced toward Eastwood with a grateful nod. "We've been planning this for a long time, waiting for the right case, the right moment. When I heard you had become a lawyer, and such a ruthless one, I knew you were the perfect person to help us expose what these people have been doing." Hayes looked from her to Eastwood and back again. "But I've been working against you this whole time. I've been trying to help the developers secure the land. Sometimes," Eastwood said from where he sat, "the best way to bring down a corrupt system is from the inside." Linda opened the file, revealing stacks of documents, photographs, and maps. "Your father would have been proud of you, Richard. He always said you were too smart for your own good." Her eyes shone with unshed tears. "Now it's time to be smart for the right reasons." As the bailiff announced that the recess was ending, Hayes looked down at the evidence his aunt had brought. Evidence that would change everything about the case he thought he was fighting. His hands trembled slightly as he realized what was happening. "All this time," he said quietly to Eastwood, "when I was mocking you, trying to humiliate you, you were actually giving me a chance to redeem myself." Eastwood's weathered face showed a hint of that famous smile again. "Everyone deserves a second act, kid, even lawyers." The courtroom doors opened as Judge Harmon returned to her bench, her face serious as she prepared to hear what promised to be explosive new evidence. The packed gallery fell silent, everyone sensing that the real drama was only just beginning. Judge Harmon rapped her gavel twice as she settled back into her seat. The courtroom immediately fell silent, all eyes drawn to the drama unfolding before them. Richard Hayes stood at his table, no longer the confident, sneering attorney from just an hour ago. Beside him, his Aunt Linda kept one hand protectively on the accordion file containing what she claimed was evidence that would change everything. "Court is back in session," Judge Harmon announced, her voice carrying across the hushed room. She peered over her glasses at the three attorneys representing Meridian Development Group, who had spent the recess in urgent, whispered conversations. "Are we ready to proceed?" The lead attorney for the developers, a thin man named Wilson, stood up. "Your Honor, in light of unexpected developments, my clients would like to request a continuance to properly assess any new evidence that might be presented." "I bet they would," someone muttered from the gallery, causing a ripple of nervous laughter. Judge Harmon silenced the room with a look. "Given the serious nature of the allegations that have been raised, I'm inclined to hear what evidence Mr. Eastwood and Ms. Hayes have brought forward today." She turned to Hayes. "Counselor, what is your position on this matter now?" Everyone watched as Hayes straightened his tie and cleared his throat. The transformation in his demeanor was striking. Gone was the arrogance, replaced by something that looked almost like purpose. "Your Honor," he began, his voice steady despite the extraordinary situation, "I find myself in an unusual position. I believe there is merit to examining the evidence my aunt has gathered." He hesitated, then added, "I would also like to request that I be allowed to withdraw as counsel for Meridian Development Group due to a newly discovered conflict of interest." The developers' attorneys erupted in protest. Wilson stepped forward, his face flushed. "This is completely irregular. Mr. Hayes can't simply switch sides in the middle of proceedings." "I'm not switching sides," Hayes replied calmly. "I'm recusing myself based on personal connections to the disputed property that I was previously unaware of." Judge Harmon considered this for a moment, then nodded. Request granted, Mr. Hayes. Please step back. Meridian's remaining counsel can continue to represent their interests. She turned to Eastwood, who still sat in the witness stand. Now, Mr. Eastwood, you were about to explain the relevance of this family connection to our current property dispute. Eastwood leaned forward slightly. The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the old heating system clicking in the background. The land we're discussing today, he began, has been at the center of a pattern of acquisitions by Meridian Development Group. On paper, everything looks legal. They find properties with complicated histories, identify technical flaws in the ownership records, then use those flaws to invalidate longtime owners' claims. Wilson jumped to his feet again. Your Honor, this is hearsay and speculation. It's neither, came a new voice from the back of the courtroom. All heads turned to see an older man in a rumpled suit making his way down the center aisle. He carried a leather briefcase that looked as weathered as he did. Frank Thompson, County Records Office, he announced as he reached the front. I've brought the original survey maps and property records that Ms. Hayes requested. Judge Harmon raised an eyebrow. This is highly unusual, Mr. Thompson. These records couldn't have been subpoenaed through normal channels. Thompson's expression was grim. They would have been missing if anyone had tried, Your Honor. Just like the other records that disappeared whenever Meridian targeted a new property. He placed his briefcase on the evidence table. I've been keeping copies off-site, been waiting for someone to finally take these folks on. The atmosphere in the courtroom shifted again, the sense of witnessing something important growing stronger. Hayes moved to sit beside his aunt in the gallery as Thompson was sworn in as a witness. Eastwood watched all this with that same steady gaze, seemingly unsurprised by these developments. When Thompson finished explaining how he'd documented years of suspicious record alterations, Judge Harmon turned back to Eastwood. Mr. Eastwood, please continue with your testimony. Eastwood nodded. After the fire, after Tom Hayes, Richard's father, saved my life, I made it my business to keep track of that land. Not just because of what I owed him, but because he made me promise something while we waited for the ambulance. The courtroom was completely still, everyone hanging on his words. He was pretty badly burned, Eastwood continued, his voice growing softer with the memory. The doctors didn't think he'd make it, he knew that. So he asked me to look out for his family if anything happened to him, to make sure the land stayed protected. Linda Hayes dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. Beside her, Richard stared at the floor, his shoulders tense. I tried, Eastwood said. When the family had to sell after Tom's death, I attempted to buy the property through a trust, to hold it until Richard was old enough to take it back. But someone else got there first, a shell company that, years later, turned out to be one of Meridian's early acquisitions. Wilson stood again, his composure clearly cracking. Your Honor, whatever personal grievance Mr. Eastwood may have against my clients, it doesn't change the legal status of the property. Actually, Thompson interjected, holding up a yellowed document from his briefcase. It might. This is the original deed with the property boundaries as they were recorded in 1952. And this, he held up a newer document, is the version that currently exists in county records. Notice anything different? Judge Harmon took both documents and examined them closely. Her expression darkened. The boundary markers have been altered. The creek line has been moved nearly a quarter mile. Exactly. Thompson nodded. That change invalidates not just the Hayes family claim, but at least 6 other properties that Meridian has acquired in the last decade, all based on falsified boundaries. A murmur spread through the courtroom. One of Meridian's attorneys whispered urgently to Wilson, who was beginning to look physically ill. Your Honor, Wilson began, my clients purchased these properties in good faith, relying on county records that someone in your organization altered, Thompson interrupted. I've documented at least 17 instances where records were checked out for review by Meridian representatives and returned with subtle but significant changes. Judge Harmon's expression grew increasingly severe. If these allegations are true, Mr. Wilson, we're looking at criminal fraud, not just a civil dispute. The gallery broke into excited whispers. A reporter slipped out the back door, clearly eager to break the story. Through all of this, Eastwood remained calm in the witness chair, watching as the truth he'd apparently been working toward for years finally came to light. Linda leaned over to her nephew. "Your father tried to fight them, you know. When the first survey crews came out and started moving boundary markers, that's when the accident at the film set happened." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "It wasn't really an accident, Richard." Hayes looked up sharply, the color draining from his face. "What are you saying?" "The fire that killed your father wasn't an accident," Linda repeated, her eyes never leaving his. "He had evidence that someone was tampering with property records. He was planning to take it to the county commissioners the day after the fire." Hayes turned to look at Eastwood, a question in his eyes. Eastwood gave a small, confirming nod. "I didn't know it at the time. It took years to put the pieces together. By then the trail was cold, but the pattern was clear. Every time someone stood up to these developers, something happened. An accident, a sudden financial crisis, health problems." Judge Harmon, overhearing this exchange, leaned forward. "Mr. Eastwood, are you suggesting that the developers were involved in Mr. Hayes' death?" The courtroom fell completely silent. "I'm not suggesting anything, Your Honor," Eastwood replied carefully. "I'm just saying that Tom Hayes had evidence of fraud. He died before he could present that evidence, and the company that benefited from his death is the same one trying to develop his land today." Wilson erupted from his seat. "This is outrageous. My clients are being accused of murder, based on nothing but Hollywood dramatic flair and coincidence." "Not coincidence," Thompson said, pulling another document from his briefcase. "Pattern." He held up a list. "These are the names of 7 people who raised objections to Meridian's land acquisitions over the past 15 years. Every one of them experienced a personal tragedy shortly after going public with their concerns." Richard Hayes stood up suddenly, his face a mask of shock and dawning fury. "You're saying my father was killed because he threatened their business?" His voice rose as he turned to face the Meridian attorneys. "You people killed him for a piece of land?" "Order." Judge Harmon's gavel came down hard. "Mr. Hayes, control yourself. These are serious allegations that will need to be properly investigated." But Hayes wasn't listening. 30 years of buried grief and anger seemed to surface all at once as he moved toward the developer's table. "Richard, no." Linda grabbed his arm, her grip surprisingly strong for her age. "This isn't how your father would want you to handle this." "Listen to her, kid," Eastwood said, his voice cutting through Hayes's anger. "There's a better way to honor your father. A legal way." Hayes stopped, chest heaving, as Eastwood's words reached through his rage. He looked back at the Hollywood icon, who had somehow engineered this entire confrontation. "Why?" Hayes asked, his voice breaking slightly. "Why did you wait so long? Why go through this whole charade with me today?" Eastwood's expression softened slightly. "Because we needed someone on the inside, someone they trusted, someone who could access the right documents once they knew what to look for." He nodded toward the accordion file on the table. "Your aunt has been gathering evidence for years. What she couldn't get, Thompson kept safe. But we needed someone who could legally force Meridian to produce their internal records. Someone like the lawyer representing them in court," Hayes whispered, understanding dawning on his face. "Exactly," Eastwood nodded. "When I heard you'd become their attorney, I knew it was time. Tom would have been proud of you for using your skills to uncover the truth." Judge Harmon cleared her throat. "Given the serious nature of these allegations, I'm ordering all property records related to Meridian Development Group to be secured immediately. Mr. Wilson, your clients are not to leave the jurisdiction." She looked around the stunned courtroom. "This hearing is adjourned until Monday morning, at which time I expect the district attorney's office to be present." As the gavel came down, the courtroom exploded into activity. Reporters rushed for the doors, the Meridian attorneys huddled in urgent consultation, and courthouse security moved closer to ensure no one tried to leave with evidence. Through it all, Richard Hayes stood motionless, staring at the photograph of his father and Clint Eastwood from So Man. The weekend passed in a blur for Richard Hayes. After 30 years of building his reputation as the kind of lawyer who would do anything to win, he now found himself on the opposite side of a case that had suddenly become deeply personal. He spent Saturday and Sunday in his Aunt Linda's small house on the edge of town, poring over the documents she had collected over the years, connecting dots he hadn't even known existed. Monday morning arrived with a pale winter sun and a courthouse, surrounded by news vans. Richard walked up the steps alongside his aunt, both of them ignoring the shouted questions from reporters. Clint Eastwood was already inside, sitting quietly in the hallway outside the courtroom. Despite being in his 90s, he looked remarkably composed in his simple navy suit. "Ready?" Eastwood asked as they approached. Richard nodded, though he wasn't sure if he'd ever be truly ready for what lay ahead. "I still can't believe I spent my career working for people like Meridian." "You didn't know," Linda said gently, patting his arm. "That's the point of all this, to bring the truth to light." The courtroom was packed beyond capacity. Judge Harmon had moved the proceedings to the largest courtroom in the building, but even so, people were standing against the back wall. News of Friday's dramatic revelations had spread quickly, drawing curious onlookers, reporters, and even families who suspected they too had been victimized by Meridian's tactics. Richard noticed Wilson and the other Meridian attorneys huddled with a new group of lawyers, expensive-looking men and women from a prestigious firm in the state capital. They had apparently called in reinforcements. "All rise," the bailiff announced as Judge Harmon entered. Once everyone was seated, the judge surveyed the crowded room with a solemn expression. "Before we begin, I want to make it clear that while this started as a civil property dispute, we are now potentially looking at criminal matters as well. Representatives from the District Attorney's Office and the State Bureau of Investigation are present today." She nodded toward two serious-looking individuals sitting near the front. Richard glanced at Eastwood, who gave a small nod of satisfaction. This was clearly part of what he had been working toward all along. "Now," Judge Harmon continued, "we have some preliminary matters to address. Mr. Wilson, I understand your clients wish to make a statement." Wilson stood, looking considerably less confident than he had on Friday. "Yes, Your Honor. My clients categorically deny any involvement in record falsification or any other illegal activities. They maintain that they purchased all properties, including the former Hayes land, through legitimate means and in good faith." "That statement might carry more weight," Judge Harmon replied dryly, "if 3 of your clients hadn't attempted to leave the state over the weekend despite my clear instruction." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Wilson's face flushed. "Your Honor, my clients were not fleeing. They had prior engagements that explanation can be presented to the judge handling their bail hearings." Judge Harmon cut him off. "Now, regarding the evidence presented on Friday about altered county records, I'd like to hear from Mr. Thompson first." Frank Thompson took the stand and was sworn in. Unlike Friday, when he had appeared unexpectedly, today he seemed prepared, with organized folders of documentation. For the next hour, he methodically laid out evidence showing how property records had been systematically altered over a 15-year period, always to the benefit of Meridian Development Group. And these alterations weren't minor, Thompson explained, showing a series of maps on the courtroom's projection screen. They changed boundary lines, erased easements, and in some cases, completely rewrote the historical ownership chain to create artificial breaks that could be exploited legally. Richard watched the faces of the jurors as Thompson explained how even a small change in a property description could invalidate a family's claim to land they'd owned for generations. He saw the growing anger in their expressions as they began to understand the scope of the deception. When Thompson finished, Eastwood was called to the stand again. This time, rather than being subjected to mockery, he was treated with respect by everyone in the courtroom. "Mr. Eastwood," the prosecutor began, "you've been tracking Meridian's activities for years according to your previous testimony. Can you tell us why?" Eastwood shifted slightly in his seat, his weathered hands resting on his knees. "After Tom Hayes died saving my life, I made him a promise. I told him I'd look out for his family, make sure they didn't lose everything. I failed in that promise when the land was sold." He glanced at Richard and Linda. "But I never stopped trying to. Make it right. And what led you to suspect that Mr. Hayes's death might not have been an accident? The prosecutor asked. Wilson jumped up. Objection, Your Honor. This is pure speculation and highly prejudicial. Your Honor, the prosecutor countered, we're establishing a pattern of suspicious events surrounding Meridian's land acquisitions. Judge Harmon considered briefly. I'll allow it, but tread carefully, Counselor. Eastwood's blue eyes were clear and direct as he answered. Tom had been looking into some strange things happening with property markers. Stakes being moved overnight. Survey flags disappearing. The day before the fire, he told me he had proof someone was manipulating records at the county office. He was excited. Said he was going to blow the whole thing wide open. The courtroom was utterly silent as Eastwood continued. The next day, there was a fire in his trailer on set. They said it was an electrical short. Tom got 3 people out before the whole thing collapsed with him inside. Eastwood paused, his expression momentarily distant with memory. I didn't connect it to the land issues at the time. It took years before I started to see the pattern. What pattern was that? The prosecutor asked. People who opposed Meridian's developments had bad things happen to them. Not always deadly things, but enough to make them back off. A sudden IRS audit, a family emergency that forced them to move away, a business that mysteriously lost its customers. Eastwood leaned forward slightly. Once is coincidence. Twice is interesting. 17 times is a pattern. The lead attorney for Meridian stood up, his voice sharp with indignation. Your Honor, this is nothing but circumstantial innuendo designed to prejudice the court against my clients. Perhaps, Judge Harmon replied, but given the documented evidence of record tampering, I think it warrants investigation. Throughout the morning, more witnesses took the stand. Former landowners who'd lost property to Meridian under suspicious circumstances, a forensic accountant who had traced the company's shell corporations, a former Meridian employee who testified about being instructed to adjust documents. During the lunch recess, Richard found himself standing with Eastwood and his aunt in a small conference room, away from the press and spectators. They're going to offer a settlement, Richard said, his legal training allowing him to read the signals the Meridian team had been sending. They'll return the Hayes property and maybe a few others, in exchange for dropping the criminal implications. Eastwood's expression hardened slightly. That's not good enough, not after what they did to your father, not after how many other families they've hurt. Linda nodded her agreement. Tom didn't die for a piece of land, Richard. He died trying to expose the truth. We can't settle for less than that. Richard looked between them. These 2 people who had been fighting a battle he hadn't even known existed while he'd been building, his career representing the very forces they opposed. You're right, he said finally. No settlement. We see this through. When court resumed after lunch, Richard was prepared for Meridian's settlement offer. What he wasn't prepared for was being called to the witness stand himself. Mr. Hayes, the prosecutor began after he was sworn in, until Friday you were representing Meridian Development Group in this case, correct? Yes, Richard replied, acutely aware of the hostile glares from his former clients. And during your preparation for this case, did you have access to Meridian's internal documents regarding the property in dispute? Richard nodded. I did. As their attorney, I had full access to their files. Did you notice anything unusual in those files? The prosecutor asked. Wilson was on his feet immediately. Objection, Your Honor. Attorney-client privilege. The prosecutor smiled slightly. Your Honor, Mr. Hayes is no longer representing Meridian, and the crime-fraud exception to privilege applies when documents may have been used in furtherance of illegal activity. Judge Harmon nodded. Objection overruled. The witness may answer. Richard took a deep breath. Yes. I noticed several inconsistencies in the documentation, particularly regarding survey dates and property descriptions. At the time, I assumed they were clerical errors. And now? The prosecutor prompted. Now I believe they were deliberate alterations, part of a systematic effort to undermine legitimate property claims. Richard's voice grew stronger as he continued. What's more, I discovered emails between Meridian executives discussing what they called obstacle removal, their term for dealing with people who oppose their developments. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Wilson and his team looked stricken. And did these emails mention specific individuals? The prosecutor asked when order was restored. Richard nodded gravely. Yes, including my father, Tom Hayes. Linda gasped softly from her seat. Eastwood reached over to steady her. And what did these emails say about your father? The prosecutor asked. Richard's jaw tightened. They referred to him as a problem that would solve itself just 3 days before the fire that killed him. This time, the courtroom's reaction couldn't be quieted with a gavel. Judge Harmon had to threaten to clear the room before order was restored. When Richard returned to his seat, he felt oddly lightheaded, as though a weight he hadn't known he was carrying had finally been lifted. He'd spent his career being the ruthless one, the attorney who would say or do anything to win. Now, for the first time, he understood what it felt like to fight for something that actually mattered. The day continued with more testimony, more evidence, more damning revelations about Meridian's tactics. By late afternoon, it was clear that what had started as a simple property dispute had evolved into one of the biggest fraud cases the county had ever seen. As court adjourned for the day, Richard found himself standing again with Eastwood on the courthouse steps, surrounded by reporters shouting questions. Mr. Eastwood, how does it feel to expose this fraud after all these years? Eastwood, ever composed, simply replied, It feels like keeping a promise to a friend. A reporter turned to Richard. Mr. Hayes, will you be filing a wrongful death suit regarding your father? Before Richard could answer, Eastwood placed a hand on his shoulder. One fight at a time, the Hollywood legend said quietly. Your father would be proud of what you did today. Richard nodded, suddenly finding it hard to speak. As they made their way through the crowd, he realized that for the first time in his adult life, he wasn't thinking about winning a case or advancing his career. He was thinking about justice. Real justice, not the technical legal kind he'd specialized in for so long. And somewhere, he hoped, his father was indeed watching and proud. The final day of the trial dawned bright and clear, the kind of perfect autumn morning that seemed at odds with the gravity of what was happening inside the courthouse. The parking lot had filled 2 hours before proceedings were scheduled to begin, with people coming from 3 counties away to witness the conclusion of what the local paper had dubbed the Eastwood Revelation. Richard Hayes arrived early, slipping in through a side entrance to avoid the crush of reporters and onlookers. He'd barely slept, spending most of the night reviewing the closing statement he planned to deliver, not as Meridian's attorney, but as a witness for the prosecution and, in a sense, for his father's memory. In the quiet of the empty courtroom, he sat at the prosecutor's table, spreading his notes before him. The doors at the back opened, and he turned to see Clint Eastwood, walking slowly down the center aisle, looking remarkably fit despite his age and the stress of the past few days. Morning, Eastwood said simply, taking a seat in the first row of the gallery. Richard nodded in greeting. Did you ever think it would come to this when you started looking into Meridian all those years ago? Eastwood's expression remained calm, but his eyes showed a depth of feeling that his famous movie roles had only hinted at. I hoped for justice, he said, but justice takes different forms. Sometimes it's quiet and private. Sometimes. He gestured to the empty courtroom that would soon be packed with people. It needs an audience. Before Richard could respond, his Aunt Linda arrived, accompanied by Frank Thompson from the county records office. Behind them came a steady stream of people, former landowners who had lost property to Meridian, reporters clutching notebooks, curious locals who had taken the day off work to be present for what promised to be a historic verdict. By the time Judge Harmon entered at precisely 9:00 a.m., the courtroom was filled beyond capacity, with courthouse security turning people away at the doors. All rise, the bailiff called, and the room fell silent as the judge took her seat. Be seated, Judge Harmon said, adjusting her glasses as she surveyed the packed courtroom. Before we begin today's proceedings, I want to address something. She looked directly at the Meridian attorneys, who seemed to have multiplied overnight. There were now 7 of them, including 2 from a prestigious firm in New York. This court has received multiple requests for delays, changes of venue, and motions to dismiss. All have been denied. The evidence presented over the past week is too significant to ignore, and the public interest demands resolution. Richard couldn't help but feel a small spark of satisfaction at the frustrated expressions on the faces of Meridian's legal team. These were tactics he himself had used countless times in the past. Delay, distract, wear down the opposition. Seeing them fail gave him an unexpected sense of justice already being served. "We will proceed with closing arguments," Judge Harmon continued. "The prosecution may begin." The lead prosecutor, a veteran attorney named Reynolds, approached the jury box with measured steps. For nearly an hour, he methodically recapped the evidence against Meridian Development Group, the altered records, the pattern of harassment against opponents, the suspicious accidents that befell those who stood in their way, and the damning internal emails discovered by Richard that suggested direct knowledge of Tom Hayes' planned whistleblowing before his death. "Ladies and gentlemen," Reynolds concluded, "what began as a simple property dispute has revealed something far more sinister, a systematic campaign to defraud honest citizens of their land through document falsification, intimidation, and possibly even violence. Today you have the power to end this campaign and bring justice to its victims." When Reynolds returned to his seat, Wilson stood to present Meridian's defense. Gone was the smug confidence he had displayed at the beginning of the trial. Now he moved like a man walking through quicksand, each argument sinking under the weight of the evidence against his clients. "There has been much emotion in this courtroom," Wilson began, his voice strained. "And emotion can cloud judgment. Yes, there were irregularities in some property records. Yes, some of Meridian's business practices may have been aggressive. But to leap from these facts to accusations of conspiracy and—" He paused, seemingly unable to bring himself to say the word murder. Worse requires a logical jump that the evidence simply doesn't support. As Wilson continued his increasingly desperate defense, Richard noticed movement at the back of the courtroom. A man had entered and was whispering urgently to one of the junior Meridian attorneys. The young lawyer's face paled visibly, and he immediately passed a note down the table to Wilson, who faltered mid-sentence as he read it. "Is everything all right, Mr. Wilson?" Judge Harmon asked, her eyes narrowing. "Yes, Your Honor," Wilson replied, though his expression suggested otherwise. "May I request a brief recess to confer with my clients?" "You may have 5 minutes," Judge Harmon said, clearly suspicious of the interruption. As the Meridian team huddled in urgent consultation, Richard leaned toward Reynolds. "Something's happened." Reynolds nodded grimly. "Good news for justice, bad news for them, if I had to guess." When court resumed, Wilson approached the bench, requesting to speak privately with the judge and the prosecution. After a brief sidebar, conversation that involved increasingly animated gestures from Wilson, Judge Harmon addressed the courtroom. "Ladies and gentlemen, there has been a development. The defense has indicated that they wish to change their plea." A murmur swept through the courtroom. Beside Richard, Reynolds sat up straighter, his expression one of cautious triumph. Judge Harmon continued. "Meridian Development Group has agreed to plead guilty to multiple counts of fraud, document falsification, and conspiracy to commit these crimes. In exchange, they have offered full cooperation with ongoing investigations into related matters." The gallery erupted in exclamations of surprise and scattered applause. Richard felt a hand on his shoulder and turned to see his Aunt Linda, tears streaming down her face. "They're admitting it," she whispered. "After all these years, they're finally admitting what they did." As Judge Harmon called for order, Richard glanced at Eastwood, who sat motionless, his expression unreadable. 30 years of patient work was finally bearing fruit, yet the Hollywood legend seemed neither triumphant nor celebratory, just watchful, as though waiting for something more. That something more came after Judge Harmon had outlined the terms of the plea agreement. As part of their cooperation, Meridian had provided new information about the fire that had killed Tom Hayes. The prosecution has been provided with documents suggesting that the fire on the movie set was deliberately set to silence Mr. Hayes before he could present evidence of record tampering, Judge Harmon announced, her voice heavy with the weight of the revelation. This information has been forwarded to the State Bureau of Investigation for immediate action. Linda's grip on Richard's shoulder tightened to the point of pain. 30 years of suspicion had just been confirmed in the most public way possible. His father hadn't died in an accident. He had been murdered for trying to protect his land and expose corruption. When the court finally adjourned for the day, with sentencing scheduled for the following week, Richard found himself standing outside the courthouse with Eastwood and Linda surrounded by reporters shouting questions. "Mr. Hayes, how does it feel to learn the truth about why our father's death after all these years? Mr. Eastwood, did you suspect foul play all along? Ms. Hayes, will your family pursue further legal action?" Richard raised a hand, and surprisingly, the reporters fell silent, waiting for him to speak. "My father died trying to protect his land and expose wrongdoing," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion churning inside him. "For 30 years, his death was written off as an accident. Today we learned the truth, not just about him but about dozens of other families who had their land stolen through fraud and intimidation." He paused, looking at the crowd of faces before him. Some belonging to other victims of Meridian's tactics, others to simple townspeople who had come to witness justice being done. "This case was never just about a piece of land," Richard continued. "It was about right and wrong. It was about the truth. And thanks to Mr. Eastwood's persistence and my aunt's determination, that truth has finally come to light." A reporter called out, "Will you be pursuing a wrongful death lawsuit?" Richard shook his head. "No amount of money can bring my father back. What matters is that his name is cleared, that everyone knows he died trying to do the right thing. The criminal investigations will ensure those responsible face justice." As the crowd began to disperse, Richard turned to Eastwood. "I don't know how to thank you," he said quietly. "For 30 years you kept a promise to a man most people would have forgotten within months." Eastwood's weathered face softened slightly. "Your father did something rare in this world. He put others before himself without hesitation, without thinking about the cost. That kind of courage deserves to be honored." He nodded toward the courthouse behind them. "This was never about it was about keeping my word to a friend." Linda stepped forward, taking Eastwood's hand in both of hers. "Tom would have been so proud of what happened here today. Not just the verdict, but seeing his son stand up for what's right." Richard felt a strange mixture of emotions. Grief for the father he'd lost, pride in what they'd accomplished, and a surprising sense of lightness, as though a burden he hadn't known he was carrying had finally been lifted. "What happens now?" he asked, looking between his aunt and Eastwood. "With the land, I mean." "That's up to you," Eastwood replied. "It belongs to your family again. The court's ruling invalidates all of Meridian's claims." Linda smiled through her tears. "Your father always said that land wasn't just dirt and trees. It was history, memory, a connection to those who came before, and those who will come after." Richard nodded slowly, thinking of the father he'd barely known, the man who had saved lives and stood up against corruption at the cost of his own life. For the first time he felt a real connection to that legacy. "Then we'll honor that connection," he said. "Maybe create something that helps other families facing similar battles. A resource center named after him." As they walked away from the courthouse together, the aging movie star, the determined sister, and the son who had found his way back to his father's values, Richard realized something important. The ruthless lawyer who had mocked Clint Eastwood in court just days ago was gone, replaced by someone new. Or perhaps someone who had been there all along, waiting to be rediscovered. Behind them, the setting sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps, marking the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. A story of justice delayed but finally delivered, of promises kept across decades, and of a father's legacy redeemed through truth years ago.